This next episode of the podcast is with Ben Lamm, the founder and CEO of Colossal Biosciences. Colossal Biosciences is the first de-extinction company in the world. It's crazy. They are working to bring back the woolly mammoth, the thylacine, which we talk a lot about in this episode. The thylacine is the Tasmanian tiger, and the dodo. Ben Lamm co-founded Colossal with George Church. George Church is considered the forefather of modern synthetic biology. He developed the first direct genome sequencing method in 1984. His lab at Harvard, the Church Lab, has been at the forefront of countless breakthroughs in genetic engineering for decades. I do get the feeling that Colossal has become a sort of de facto commercialization arm of George Church's lab. So 2 examples. One is breaking. Basically some PhD students at George Church's lab were sort of dumpster diving for novel enzymes in landfills. They were looking for evolution of enzymes in landfills that were more adept at decomposing plastic or forever chemicals than anything we've found to date. And they found one. They found an enzyme that is actually quite good at decomposing plastic. So they then are creating it via synthetic biology and commercializing it. Colossal incubated this company. It spun out. It's now its own company. There's also Form Bio. Form Bio is a leading computational biology company. It's essentially the best-in-class software for synthesizing and modeling and testing new gene therapies for the pharmaceutical industry. Things like this are just going to keep happening at Colossal because the truth is they're leveraging tools for their big, hairy, audacious goal of bringing a woolly mammoth back. They have to create tools to pursue their goal, and those tools have applications beyond just their specific purpose. And so I'll start the interview here with Ben in a second, but they're sort of like NASA, and you'll hear me make that reference to Ben, but they're sort of like NASA. They have a big psychologically resonant goal, and in order to actually achieve that goal, they are creating whole categories of new tools along the way. So I hope you give it a listen and enjoy. With that, I'll leave you to this episode with Ben Lamm of Colossal Biosciences.
You've got this big, put a man on the moon, this big, audacious, psychologically resonant goal. And then in efforts to pursue that goal, you're developing core competencies and technologies that are extremely useful in all sorts of categories that can be spun off and commercialized. And you're also attracting a ton of talent along the way.
Yeah, if you want to go work on, if you want to be in synthetic biology, for example, do you want to work on yeast or do you want to work on extinct mammoth cells, right? Like, well, what is more interesting from a day-to-day perspective, right? Like, there's more challenges, to your point, to solve on these multicellular organisms. And then you layer on the fact that you're also working with ancient DNA and there's this charismatic component to it. It really has allowed us to attract just insanely incredible talent.
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's been so fun to do research into this subject matter the past week or so. It's just been really fun. Just reading a lot, getting into all sorts of content. I kind of can't believe we're at this moment, to be honest. It feels like we're in a parallel universe where all of a sudden things are possible that never seemed possible. It's just kind of crazy from my perspective. I'll just start with the big question. Are we as human beings in control of evolution now?
I don't know if we've entered a phase where we're in control of evolution, right? But I think that in a isolated scenario, we do have the tools to do directed evolution and accelerate that evolution through genetic engineering. So I think that's for specific organisms and whatnot. For ecosystems and geoengineering as a whole, and then how that applies to individual species, probably not intentional control, but we probably have unintentional control.
It also kind of seems like the beginning. To me, it seems like these tools are advancing rapidly and how we use them will evolve over time. My perspective is there's a lot of emphasis on AI in today's cultural environment, rightfully so, it's amazing. But that AI's applications to the world that you're in is the big thing, is the most transformative thing when people look back 1,000 years from now?
Yeah, I think that AI certainly makes what we are working on at Colossal possible today. Without AI and automation, it would take us decades, if not longer, to just get to where we are, right? To actually be able to look at these genomes, do the comparative genomic research, and then try to start to understand pathways and subpathways. There's so much to it, right? Outside of just the lab experimentation, so much of it is software and compute. I think that's one thing that people sometimes miss when they come see Colossal at first. They're like, they come see the lab, they see all of it, but I think they are sometimes very shocked about how much actually happens on the computer, right? From designing the guides and the experiments all the way through kind of the comparative genomics on a per species basis. So for us, AI enables us to do what we do, so much so that we have entire AI teams that are dedicated to making it possible. What's really interesting, though, what you said, and kind of started with directed evolution, is that we kind of have the base tools coupled with AI, and then eventually coupled with, even bigger and more faster ways of simultaneous compute in the world of quantum, where we will be able to not just guide life, but truly engineer life, right? And so we are kind of to your point, it does feel like the beginning, but in some cases, the beginning of things is very slow. I feel like given the adoption of some of these other technologies like automation, AI, and even quantum, that beginning is going to accelerate very, very quickly from here, which is pretty exciting.
So one study or piece of media I read is that there's a company that trained a large language model on sort of the full codex of genomic information, the logic of physical chemistry at the DNA and molecular level, and then asked it to create a new protein that does the same function as CRISPR, which cuts pretty efficiently at various points in the genetic code, but also has offsite mutations. And those offsite mutations, per a different study I read, seem to multiply at the offspring level. They did a study with zebrafish, I think it was. And
Zebrafish are a great model organism that people use,
because they reproduce so quickly, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, them and mice have been like two of the big go-tos, right? And then you get into pigs, and then eventually and for humans, you get into non-human primates and whatnot.
So CRISPR won the Nobel. It was observed in nature. It's basically bacteria's immune system. But this large language model approach to a new CRISPR-like protein dramatically reduced offsite mutations by 98% or something. So it was billions of years of evolution to come up with this particular repeating palindrome.
And everybody kind of just calls, it's funny about the world that we live in is everybody calls all genome engineering now, they're like, oh, it's just CRISPR. So it's, to your point, it's a very specific tool or a very specific job of cutting the genome. But what's interesting in inserting your guide RNAs of what you want to deliver, right, to then, get delivered in that cut. But what's interesting is that it's just one tool. And to your point, what's interesting about AI and specifically more and more training data sets is we're starting to see significantly better tools and technologies that are already coming out from a genome engineering perspective that aren't CRISPR, right? But where I think AI and specifically the combination of compute and AI coupled with the right level of probably in silico manufacturing will be in DNA synthesis. So we're actually now synthesizing. So when you think about the work that we do at Colossal, right? We've developed a precision editing tool that we don't talk about that much publicly, but that doesn't have those off-target or off-site effects like that you're talking about, right? So it's very, very minimal, but it offers a high degree of precision in terms of the editing that we're doing almost, in a multiplex fashion, right? So for us, given the number of edits we need to do, we really kind of have two choices. We can synthesize big pieces of the genome, right? And then insert that in a large cargo delivery. It's option one. Option two is we got to get really good at multiplex editing, meaning making a lot of edits all over the genome at the same time, especially when you have different genes that work together. So we'll take the mammoth, for example. There's a slew of different genes, but we found that there's 8 to 12 genes that work together, that really drive the hair phenotypes. Well, if you're just doing individual edits to one gene, well, then it's unclear how that's going to work with these other genes if you're only editing that one gene, if you're limited based on using CRISPR or one of these tools that makes a single edit, right? Because then you're having to make a single edit. So your choices are, you could synthesize all of those genes, but that's pretty big. And then you've got to deliver it, and you got to deliver in a way where it doesn't like kill the cell, which is hard and complicated. Or you can develop the tools so that you can do multiplex editing, or you can edit, like, think of it as like a map. You can edit lots of points along that map, but you can do it all at the same time so that you're not in a situation where you've broken it by solving it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's incredible, and it's real. It's happening. I mean, it seems to me that you mentioned the mammoth 2028. I know you're working on the thylacine and the dodo. It seems like there will be species before 2028.
We will definitely have, the mammoth will not be the first species that is born.
Yeah. Maybe the thylacine, maybe the dodo, something with a shorter gestation period.
Shorter gestation than 22 months.
Yeah. And so the thylacine, maybe we can talk about that. So that's went extinct in 1932 or something like that.
But if you go to Tasmania, there are people that still believe they see them now. And so, yeah, so what's interesting is there's been this, like, it's almost like the Yeti or like Bigfoot, only it 100% existed, right? Because we have like videos and we've got DNA, and we know the thylacine existed. But there's like blurred, like, I mean, I get now that, you know, we have a Tasmanian tiger committee where we work with Aboriginal groups and local landowners and the government and the university down there. So I'm down there at least once a year for one of our committee meetings, right? And in those meetings, I always get pulled aside by someone that's like, you know, I've seen one. And so it's interesting because I feel like the thylacine is just outside of our grasp, right? Like, it's like people's grandparents saw them. When you think about that, people's grandparents and great-grandparents saw them. It's just out of grasp. It's just barely out of distant memory. And there's all of these videos and pictures and whatnot of them. And so I feel like it's one of those things that, you know, I don't believe they still exist because we've done a lot of research on it. But it's one of those things that, like, we can undo the sins of the past, but it has been one of those, outside of the scientific aspects of it, there's this interesting cultural aspect to it and almost like mythos to it, which has been pretty cool.
Yeah, I came across a lot of that on YouTube, and somebody giving an interview with Joe Rogan and basically trying to find the thylacine. It feels very much like Bigfoot.
You almost believe it.
Yeah.
Like, you almost believe it. Like, there was a point, like, just to be transparent, there was a point where I called Andrew Pask, who's our thylacine lead, and I called him in Australia, and I was like, when I was doing research gearing up for the thylacine launch, because I wanted to make sure I knew everything I could about it. And I was like, are you sure they're extinct? Because I've watched now like 37 YouTube videos. I've read 12 books, and it's like, and he's like, no, man, they're extinct.
They're in a remote region about,
Yeah. I've heard that pitch too. Yeah. We've been asked to fund that exhibition like numerous times.
Right. And that's I'm a mountain climber in that region. It's really hard to get. They haven't let people back to that region since COVID.
Yeah.
There's a gold mine there, and they're protecting the gold mine, and it's
really
government permits around getting there are insane.
Yeah.
So it is a really fun story, but okay. So the benefit though of bringing back the thylacine beyond the imagination, psychological benefits is there's incredible ecosystem benefits. I always get this confused, but the Tasmanian devil has sort of a contagious face tumor.
It's the only transmissible cancer that we know of. And when they eat, and I've fed them in the wild and in sanctuaries, and it's a reasonably aggressive process for them to eat. And so they'll get into fights. And when they do, it transmits this deadly facial tumor disease. And the facial tumor disease eats into them. It's an awful way to die. And what's interesting is if you look at ecosystems where the apex predator still exists, and then you look at similar ecosystems where the apex predator has been removed, you'll notice these Tasmanian devil type diseases in other species. And so when you look at predators, most people think, oh, predators are at the top of the food chain. But predators actually have to be very thoughtful about when they expend energy. It's typically an immense amount of energy that they expend to try to get a kill. If they miss so many kills, they eventually die and starve, right? They don't have the energy they need to go expend that energy in order to make that kill. So what's interesting is that apex predators typically go after the very old, the very young, and the sick, right? And so apex predators actually play this incredible role in cleaning up the ecosystem, and they actually create better populations because the, survival of the fittest, the youngest of the animals, right? That when they go after the young, guess what? The smallest, fastest ones, they just got to be faster than their brother or cousin, right? And the sick obviously are another target, and then obviously the old. And so it really creates an opportunity. Like predators are very, very thoughtful when they go make that energy expenditure for that kill. And so when they're not there, you typically have a couple of things. You have an explosion of these mezzanine animals in kind of this mid-tier if they're an apex predator. And then you typically see with that massive rises in various disease states. You see this across a different number of species. Now, can I tell you with certainty if the thylacine still existed, would the facial tumor disease exist? Maybe it would, but if it did, it would be somewhat more contained than it did here. Because if you're chasing a Tasmanian devil that is of perfect speed and health and weight and can see properly, it's going to have a higher probability of evading predation than one that can barely see, that can barely walk with this terrible disease.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like an unbalanced ecosystem. And the idea that virus or disease states emergent from unbalanced ecosystems could be the negative consequence to humans and human society is interesting. I want to kind of flip that too and ask back to the multiplexing and the very complicated genetic engineering that's going on. How do you make sure that the immune system of these creatures is not going to become sort of reservoir host to some new pathogen?
Yeah, so we get those types of questions, and we get the if you bring it back from the permafrost, then, are you going to de-extinct diseases with it? But remember, we're making very specific, precise edits, right? So we're not trying to, some of the tools and technologies that we're leveraging, if you look at xenotransplantation, right? So this is another area that George is very interested in. He's got a company called eGenesis, which is basically made genetically modified pigs that have a lower rejection threshold when you're using their organs to save a human than a non-genetically modified pig. And it's because they've gone in and actually eliminated these retroviruses that are in the pig's genomes so that, it's closer to that of a human's. And so think of it like that. We aren't going into a mammoth or a thylacine and trying to copy everything. We're identifying the core genes that made that species a species, de-extincting those genes and engineering them into a healthy living animal. And that's the closest living relative. In the case of the thylacine, it's actually the fat-tailed dunnard. It's the closest living relative. Is actually you have this marsupial wolf level animal with the thylacine, and actually this marsupial mouse level animal.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the xenotransplantation field exists. I think we've replaced a human heart with a pig heart. And
yes,
it's sort of entering the mainstream of.
Yeah, and the hard thing about xenotransplantation, it's testing, right? It's extreme use only, end of life. And so I think that if you fast forward the clock 20 years, I think that bioprinting full genetic matches of a organ will also be a thing. But I think xenotransplantation, if you look at the need for organ transplant worldwide, especially as people live longer and healthier lives, that will only increase. And I think that xenotransplantation will almost become the generic version of a drug. And so some people are oh, well, bioprinting is going to replace xenotransplantation. But I was I don't really believe that. I think that you'll have, just like in today's market, you have your premium drugs, and then you have your off-label drugs, right? That have a similar effect to various prognosis, but maybe it's not as good as the name brand versus the generic brand. And I think that's where I actually think that the xenotransplantation will be huge, but I think the limited abilities to truly test it right now is hard.
And what you're doing is so similar to that in a lot of ways. Instead of it being a medical application for humans, you're doing it to modify genes of similar species to previously extinct species so as to introduce ecosystem functionality back, rewilding back into challenged ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think in from this, to your point about innovations that come from it, right? Like we can't. I'm not going to give any exact numbers today, but we have some numbers that I think will come out in the next 6 to 12 months. From what we've seen in literature and from what we've seen in the peer-reviewed scientific community, we have vastly surpassed everyone that we know is out there in multiplex editing and some of these genome engineering tools. Which, to your point, is massively helpful for human healthcare. And so I think a lot of the tools and technologies and techniques that we're developing will have applications to human healthcare and become their own therapeutics, which is great. Therapeutic companies to help humans. And while none of our first species will be born from artificial wombs, we have a 17-person team that's working on artificial wombs. I think that there's different types of placentas, right? And so what's interesting is that Colossal actually has to solve, there's a little bit more, but there's roughly 9 different types of placentas. And we have to solve, if we're going to have different species types, we have to solve numerous types of placentas. And so what's interesting is that from a technology perspective, we will probably make it further than what is needed for human gestation in an artificial womb. We aren't working at humans, right? So on humans, so we will not leverage the technologies for humans at Colossal. But the fundamentals to the technologies could be applied to humans, whether that's a spinoff or a license of the tech and whatnot, because it is significantly harder to grow an elephant than it is to grow a human ex utero. There's different ethical and philosophical and legal and governmental challenges to growing a human than there is growing an elephant. But it is biologically much harder to grow an elephant ex utero than a human.
And applications to the food industry could be enormous.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and into conservation. Like, we're the exclusive genetic rescue partner, engineering and genetic diversity to the northern white rhinos, right? Because there's 2 left. But imagine a world where you could also then take those genetically modified embryos and grow them in 100, artificial wombs in a warehouse or a laboratory, right? We can productionize saving endangered species, which I think's really interesting, because like right now, the goal is in most conservation circles are just to protect this land and hope for the best. And that's just not a winning proposition when you think about it.
So I know you've done a ton of work to coordinate, collaborate, kind of keep open dialogue with the conservation community around rewilding. Mm-hmm. I've encountered a ton of people on this podcast, conversations where there's a skepticism to techno-optimism, just in general.
Yeah, there is. Remember, in fairness to the negative feedback of techno-optimism, we had a lot of big tech companies that came out saying that they were going to connect us and help the world. And what did most of those technology companies do? They stole our data and sold it to the highest bidder, right? So in fairness to the general public, I understand why there's some aversion to like the promise of, utopian approaches to technology, because, some of the stewards of some of these biggest platforms haven't been the absolute best. Even if their intentions were right, their monetization, share price, other things came into the effect, right? So I do think that it's okay for people to be like cautious. I hope they're cautiously optimistic, though.
Yeah. A critique I've heard is that a fear is that by embracing a techno-optimist approach to big problems like this, like species conservation, it allows people a sort of out in terms of their personal responsibility. They can then be like, oh, I don't have personal responsibility because technology is going to solve these problems. I think there's some validity to that, but at the same time, I don't have that view. I feel like that view is missing the bigger picture.
Yeah. I think you have to look at the entire system, and you have to look at it in context and in context over time, right? And so, like, take the thylacine, right? We eradicated that species. Like, it's gone. It's gone because of us. It didn't naturally go away, right? So if we can bring that back and it can help the ecosystem, then I feel like not only we have an opportunity to do it, I think we have a moral obligation to kind of do that, because our species did that, right? Like, we chose to do that. And I do think that if you look at the system as a whole, people look at, to the personal accountability side, they look at COVID and they look at what happened to the carbon footprint, look what happened to lakes and rivers and streams. We all saw photos of dolphins in the canal in Italy, right? And so everyone has these pictures, right? And in nature, and they showed how fast nature bounced back. That's fantastic, but it's not realistic in the system that is how humanity works, whether you're pro-capitalism or not pro-capitalism. You're still in a system that is established and has a lot of people feeding into it. And it's not realistic that everyone's just going to go home and shut their doors. That's just not realistic. You have these kind of crazy inflection points like in COVID where you saw that and you could see these bounce backs. I think it's much better for us to say we've been given the abilities to create technologies instead of building like another iterative version of like Zoom or an iterative version of Slack, which is another, and I'm not against Zoom or Slack, but they're just, at the end of the day, they're an iterative update, right? Like, I hope if anything, there's the Techno-Optimism where people see companies like SpaceX and others, and maybe us to a much lesser degree, but they say, let's do something that matters and let's do something that has an opportunity to make money if that's what they care about, but also make an impact. And I think that hunger is there in the younger generations, but I just don't think that, I think the blade of personal accountability and responsibility can cut a couple different ways. And one, we can take accountability and responsibility for people in the past that did things that we didn't do, right? Like eradicate the thylacine and we can hopefully fix and repair that. But at the same time, we can say it's not realistic for us to all just at home grow our own garden, eat vegan, and live based on the day and night, circadian rhythm cycle. Like that's also just not realistic. And so I think that we've got to find a nature, like kind of how they talk about, work-life balance. I think that we have to find nature-humanity integration in a way. And I don't think there's a better tool than synthetic biology to do that. I'm going to totally screw this up. I'm going to totally screw these stats up. So someone that listens to this should actually go get the actual stats because these are not the right stats. I should know this, but there used to be like 50 million beavers in America, like when the settlers came over, something like that, something crazy, right? And you're probably like, why is Ben talking to me about beavers? But what's interesting is now there's like 5 million beavers. And there's some model, and one of my board members, Tom Chi, brought it up. It was brilliant. And so in fairness to him, I need to go back and go dive deep into this. But basically, beavers are these little incredible ecosystem engineers that create wetlands that sequester more carbon than any of the direct air carbon capture systems. So you can go spend $1 trillion on direct air carbon systems, which is a technological solution, which I'm not against direct air carbon capture systems, but you can also go to just make like 20 million beavers and you can create habitats that actually have a bigger impact than all of the direct air carbon capture systems. So all I'm saying is, I think that there's ways to leverage technology in these direct air carbon capture type models, but there's also ways to leverage technologies to make more beavers, right? And then let nature do some of its own thing. So I think that we have to find the balance. And I think that at least people are starting to have the conversation versus just, say technology is good or technology is bad. I think that the answer is it's really kind of, in the eye of the beholder and also the yielder of that technological sword.
So the carbon sequestration benefits is a recurring theme of a healthier ecosystem. The mammoth rewilding efforts are thought to turn tundra into grassland and increase the albedo and decrease the ground temperature and basically lower the temperature of the earth. But there's a big theme here that I'm really curious about your thoughts on, which is like, there's an inherent intelligence to biology in general, contrasted with what is also happening in today's day and age, which is a excitement and exuberance for AI in robots doing functions. And so to put it into like contrast, let's take rewilding of the tundra, and we could bring mammoths back to trample the trees and create more grassland, but we could, and I don't think we should do this, but I'm just creating the hypothetical. We could like have mammoth like robots, also called a tractor, that have that like, plow over the trees. And is a sort of robot-based approach to fulfilling the same thing, but it doesn't actually do the same thing. And I think it doesn't do the same thing because robots don't poop, basically.
Well, they don't poop. They don't store carbon, They also don't, at least to date, they don't create more baby robots, right? Like you want these systems that work, right? Once they start creating more baby robots, I think we got bigger problems. But I think, once again, I think that there's solutions, right? Like I created a company back in the day that was a conversational OS. So it was a precursor to large language models. And we did a sentiment analysis. We had this natural language processing system that would pull in all these different systems. And I would connect all these different systems and pull all this data in. And ended up getting bought for call center deflection. And one of the negative feedbacks I got when I was on stage once talking about it was they're like, you're going to get rid of call centers. And I was like, yeah, but call center agents aren't like they're biological NLP systems, right? They're natural, like they're just listening to you and writing down those jobs. And they're like, you're going to get rid of those jobs. It's like, but those jobs shouldn't really exist when you really think about it, right? Like think about the power and the creativity of human ingenuity. And we say, this person, instead of looking at these other jobs that require creative thought or these other ideas, instead, we need you just to listen to other humans and write down the words they say and hit enter. Like that's not, and there's nothing against people that do that, but if those jobs were eliminated, the people that went for those jobs would go find other opportunities because they're not going to just sit at home and say, well, this job's gone, right? And so I do think that there's huge opportunities where technologies and automations and things like robotics will change industries. But, they've made the case for years that like the printing press or something else, at some point, one of these technologies will alleviate everything. I don't think that's the case. So I think that really the blend of these technology-based solutions, maybe not robot mammoths, but other technology-based solutions like solar and whatnot, coupled with like nature-based solutions is still the right answer. But, who knows? I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
I just find the contrast in approach and philosophy. Like I think most people who are excited about this stuff are excited about robots and real world AI applications and maybe don't have that much thought or exposure to synthetic biology. And my personal view is that the synthetic biology world is significantly more powerful in application.
I think synthetic biology, especially at scale, probably with leveraging robotics to actually manufacture things, and eventually quantum and AI today, I think the ability to guide and engineer life, I think it's as powerful as like discovering fire. It's that transformative. I think it will be the most transformative set of technologies and maybe the most dangerous too. Like it will be the most powerful set of technologies today, right? Like we now know in the colossal world, we know roughly what various genotypes to phenotypes applications. So what the editing of the genes do and what the physical attributes do. Now we don't have it for every single animal we're working on and every single type of physical attribute or phenotype that we're looking for quite yet, but we're making insane progress, right? So for example, we know the genes, and we've just spent the most amount of time on this. We know the genes and how they work together that made a woolly mammoth woolly. Like we know that. And we know that we can also modify that and take that to other species, which is also crazy and weird and interesting, right? So we can make woolly cows or whatever, right? And so I guess they're technically already furry, but you know what I mean? So it's crazy to me.
Can we make little mammoth pets?
That, what's great? So there's the two biggest requests we get are miniature mammoths and dinosaurs. Those are the two we get. We get those every day. We get those. We literally, not a day goes by where we don't get like, can we make teacup mammoths? And size is hard, right? Like size is hard. And so we actually have a whole team, a whole computational biology team just focused on size. Isn't that weird? Like when you think about it, it's weird. Like we have a computational biology team focused on just size.
Wow.
And looking at like, because we understand size differentials in elephants and other pachyderms, and at least we think we do. Who knows? But I think we think we do. And then how does that relate? To your point on the Dunart to thylacine, like that's a huge scale function jump. But like, if you can go one way, can you go the other? Like those are the things that we are exploring.
Wow. Elephants and the P53 protein.
Yes.
This is really interesting. There's a lot of research, cancer therapeutic research on the P53 protein in elephants because elephants basically don't get cancer. They're a large creature. They have a lot of cellular mutation. You'd think they'd get a lot of cancer. They don't have this P53 protein in abundance. That seems to be why they don't get cancer.
Yeah. I think they've got 7 for every one we have, something like that.
Yeah. And so in order for you to do what you're doing in terms of genetic xenotransplantation, basically, you're introducing novel genetics into an Asian elephant. The P53 protein, I assume, rejects that, unless you sort of also engineer the P53.
No, you're spot on. So one of the first things that we had to do is we created immortalized cell lines in elephants, which is actually really hard. And then in addition to that, we then had to get the number of edits in there, we had to figure out how to regulate P53. Because what you want to do is you basically want to be able to turn it down so you can make all the edits, but then you want to turn it back up because you don't want to increase the probability of an elephant getting cancer. So you've got to, once they're stably integrated and there's different passages of them, you got to turn it back up. So it was a really hard challenge. So we actually had to build an entire construct to figure out how to regulate P53, which, to your point, may have applications in human healthcare. It definitely has cancer fighting applications because basically when those cells start to senesce, when those cells, there's a detection of a strange mutation, the cells senesce. Amazing. It's truly incredible. And apparently blue whales have a similar number but elephants are easier to study. But with that said, even though there has been a lot of research in P53, there hasn't been enough research in a living multicellular organism that leverages and benefits from P53 like elephants, because guess what? It's not a mouse or a pig, and it's not a non-model organism. I would argue that Colossal knows more about elephant genetics and P53 than anyone else in the world because we're building mammoths, right? And so we're engineering mammoths, right? It's probably a better way to say it. And so we have to understand that. But your average large, your biotechs, your large pharmas, they don't study elephants. Elephants are hard to work with. They're endangered. There's so many issues with the work in general that, what most of these drug companies do is that once a group of researchers, whether it's in academia or not, get a drug that looks like it's going to make some dent in some disease state and it gets into clinical trials, they just buy them. But 99.9% of that is done on mice. Right. It's not done on elephants, right? And so and I'm not encouraging anything to be done on elephants. I'm just saying there's studying done on P53. There's not enough studying on understanding how a large multicellular organism like blue whales or elephants really leverage P53 to their benefit. And maybe we'll unlock that. I don't know. But it's super, super cool.
It's exciting. I mean, there's research here. I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, and there's a whole research department at the U using nanobots to bring P53 proteins to cancer sites in humans.
Yeah.
You couple that kind of mechanical approach with what you're learning, you're basically controlling the P53, you're activating or deactivating. And it's just crazy. I mean, it does seem like we're getting relatively close to cancer being very well understood and managed.
I think that if you look at longevity, right, and you think about what people die from on a whole, right, you have cardiac disease, right? You've got dementia and Alzheimer's, you've got cancers, and you've got diabetes, right? Those are like the big ones, right? Those are not all of them, but that's like 80% of what people of normal that don't die of a freak accident, that's like 80%, right? Stroke and heart attack and cardiac disease. But what's interesting, if you look at the therapeutics today, and I'm not even talking about what's coming out tomorrow, I'm talking about the therapeutics today, you can pretty much, with existing therapeutics in the latest and greatest medicines, diabetes is pretty much gone. Like diabetes is just gone, right? If you look at the GPL-1s, you look at metformin and other stuff, if you look at Repatha and some of these like PCKS9 inhibitors and whatnot, I'll share this personal data. My LDL is under 30. Yeah, that's the bad cholesterol that they're like, oh, you should really think about getting this under like 100, 150, right? And it's like, nope, mine's like, and they've proven that if you're under 50, it actually reverses any plaque in arteries, right? It's crazy. And so if you look at like major causes of disease state, right, in humans, it's like diabetes and heart disease, both heart attacks and strokes, those are basically solvable at this point. Blood pressure and cholesterol and A1C, those are mostly solvable today with what they are manageable, I think is a better way to say it. But you can you can get on the extreme of that bell curve. And then if you look to your point on kind of the other two classes being Alzheimer and dementia, as well as cancer, people are starting to think that many forms of Alzheimer and dementia they're almost calling it diabetes type 3. I've heard it be called, because they're literally like, well, it's just a progression of inflammation in these things, right? And so it's really interesting. No, I mean, not everyone agrees with that, but they're seeing early signs that some of the GPL, these are not coming from double-blinded. These studies are not out and published yet, but there's early indicators that the GPL-1s and 2s actually could be preventative in Alzheimer's. So we're starting to get these miracle classes of drugs. There's like this pre-Cambrian explosion of all these GPL-1 type drugs that are pretty interesting that you've started to see in the market. Mostly people have talked about them for diabetes or weight, but they actually have this interesting additional halo effect. And so I think that we are probably within 15, 20 years from a cancer vaccine, whether that's a one-time vaccine or something that you have to take monthly or weekly or whatever. One of the things that I'll stop on this tangent, but what's interesting is that one of the things that has also come out of the GPL-1 craze of the Ozempics isn't just the drug, but it's the delivery mechanism. For so long, people looked at the delivery, and this is technology, right? So this is exactly what we're talking about. This is the combination of synthetic biology and hardware and technology. Your robot mammoth example, right? But I would argue that not only is the GPL-1 such a breakthrough for humanity and what it's going to do to so many people's lives and to healthcare costs worldwide, but I would also argue that the delivery mechanism of you can be at home and get shipped a cold cooler, take shots out that are a pen. You don't have to sit there and clean off something and pull a syringe or anything like that. You literally can just take a pen, put it on your skin and press a button out of a movie. It's out of Star Trek, right? Those administered canisters, don't you remember the old school Star Trek where it's oh my gosh, something's wrong, just put the thing on and press a button. That now because there are drugs that need to stay at a certain temperature and that also need to be delivered via shot versus being digested in your digestive tract. And so who knows the applications of what new drugs that someone didn't take to market that could have huge effects on society because people are no one's going to give them a shot once a week. But now a lot of people give themselves shots at home once a week.
Right. I sometimes think Theranos was just too soon.
Yeah,
they were actually sort of
they also committed fraud.
If you put the fraud thing away though for a sec.
Well, so it's funny if you look at the Gallery test by Grail, unlike Theranos that they promised you would do, well, what did they say? A drop of blood, they could test everything, which wasn't true. But there's a test called Gallery where it tests you for 80 plus forms of cancer. It's a yearly blood test and it's incredible. And every year they're just adding more to it, right? And so now it's not a single drop. Then you can't just go into a Walgreens and get it. You have to go to your doctor. But it's one of the earliest signs of, before anything would be picked up on a CT or an MRI, it's going to be in the blood. And so this test, which is incredible, and I actually have a friend whose life it saved because they detected a very rare form of cancer very, very early. And he got treatment and he's totally fine. And so the thing about that, to your Theranos example, that is a test that you can now take and it can give you early detection signs of 80 types of cancer. 80% of the types of cancer there. That's amazing.
More every year. Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm sure you've got a busy rest of your day here.
Yeah, I've got I have a call in 1 minute. So it's kind of
okay. I'll ask you one final quick question. Maybe you asked George Church if you had unlimited money and you could focus on one incredible application of technology. One issue set, what would you do? And you came up with Colossal basically from his answer. I'm going to ask you the same question. Like, if you had an additional, set of hundreds of millions to do something else.
So I would like the equivalent of the space race in the oceans. I think that everything from like detection to and we're getting there. It's just at a fraction of what's going into space, right? But like everything from like leveraging synthetic biology to restore coral reefs to robotic underwater crop systems. There's a lot that I think, like, you look at the mass density of the planet and then you look at the surface area of the Earth minus water. We got a lot of land down there. It forces you, kind of like space, you have to create closed systems. But what's nice about these is you can just, underwater, you can just sink stuff versus like you have to put it in space at an insane cost per kilogram to leave orbit or to leave gravity. And so I think that if I had unlimited capital and more importantly, probably unlimited time, I would look at leveraging, doing more to save our oceans while leveraging those oceans, right? From like hydrothermal events to ocean wave energies. I think that smart ocean engineering could result in better sustainable systems that could also help space and other areas. So
I love that. The interview I did with Victor Vescovo was about some of that. And it's,
yeah. Victor and I share a lot of the ocean. And I mean, there should be, there should be the same amounts of efforts going into the sea that are going into space.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ben, so much for your time. It's amazing everything you all are doing. How can people get involved in some way? How do people get involved?
Yeah, I would say just follow us on social. On following It Is Colossal or our website, and then we keep getting the question of how people can help, how people can contribute. We're a private company. We have some ideas on that that are coming out in the near future. But yeah, we would love, for us, we try to be transparent and just talk to people about it. So follow us, give us feedback, give us comments, both positive and negative. We've learned a lot from the negative feedback that we've gotten. So more feedback, more suggestions is always helpful.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ben. Can't wait to share the finished episode with you.
Yeah, please do.